that. I'm Lisa Guernsey. I'm the director of the Teaching, Learning, and Tech team here at New America, and I'm really just thrilled to welcome you here today. There's going to be so much great discussion and new information and stimulating ways of thinking, so we're just thrilled to have you here. I want to take a minute for those of you who may never been to New America before to just quickly introduce you to New America and welcome you here. For those of you who may not know, New America is in its 20th year. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary last week. And we're a think tank and civic enterprise. And our quest is honestly to try to really renew the ideals that this country were founded upon, but to understand that the promise of those ideals has not yet been fulfilled in any way, and there's a lot of work to do, and we'll be talking about some of that here today. We also do that by honestly confronting the rapid changes we're seeing, both technologically and in society. And I think you'll also see a lot of that coming through in today's conversation. So one of the things that we like to do here is think about how technology is intersecting with what we're working on. This event today, I think, will be this kind of really beautiful example of that. I'm going to be, in just a minute, introducing you to our colleague, Davia Brown, and the work that she's been doing. And as we're talking here today, we'll be describing looking at what our society is recognizing, long overdue in recognizing in terms of the needs of our LGBT students and teachers. But we're also going to be recognizing the power that we can harness in various digital tools to provide support, to understand some of the issues that are going to come with those digital tools and doing that. And we're also taking a solutions-oriented perspective, which is something we like to do here at New America, to really recognize that there are problems that need to be solved, and we need to surface those, but we also need to be coming at this from the perspective that there are ways to do this, and that we as society coming together can really try to make the most and solve those problems. One of the things that we've been doing in the education policy program for the past several years is really trying to look much more deeply at this question of what it means to provide an equitable education system for all of our students in this country. And what we're realizing, and have for quite a while, is that it is one thing to just simply say that a high-quality education should be open and accessible to all. But it is another thing entirely to probe what it takes to make sure that the interactions between each student and each teacher, say, or the content that that teacher is charged with communicating to that student, that those materials and those interactions are affirming and challenging and enriching to each student. Over the past year and through the next here in our education policy program, through the work of Davia Brown, who you'll meet in a moment, through presentations across the country by our colleague Christina Ishmael, who's here with us today, through a new analysis by our colleague Jenny Muniz, who has written about culturally responsive teaching standards and who's also here today, through a whole bunch of fantastic work that's come out from our English language learner team, which is now our English learner team, and through some recent work that we've just done on special education. We are really working hard to try to deeply understand what it means to provide equity and to understand the climate and the conditions that are needed to provide an equitable education for students. So today's event, it's going to start with a presentation by Davia and a video by her that she's going to be introducing. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Brandon Tinsley. I'll be introducing him in a moment as well, of CNN. And then we'll have a question and answer period with all of you here. Many of you might be listening, I hope, as well as our amazing audience here. You're listening on and watching online. This is being live streamed. And so we encourage you to follow along on Twitter at #LGBTQ-EDU. So without further ado, let me introduce you to today's speaker. Sabia Prescott is a senior program associate and a valued colleague here with us at New America. She has spent more than a year, actually even I would say probably about 2 years, given when I know Sabia and I first started talking about these issues, digging into what it means to provide LGBTQ-inclusive curricula and teacher training materials in today's education environments. She's been doing that by partly interviewing and listening to educators, to human rights leaders, and to open technology experts around the country. And her analysis, I think you'll find, is both eye-opening and also incredibly encouraging as well. And so I'm thrilled to invite Sabia up to the podium today, and she'll take it from here. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa, and everyone. Thank you, everyone who's here. Welcome, and just thank you for being here, because this is a really remarkable thing, even to see this many people in this crowd. And something that we say a lot is that even a year ago, when we first started thinking about this and talking about it publicly, people had just no idea what we were talking about. And now to see this many people in the room show up for something like this and to be streaming it from all over the country is really remarkable. Like Lisa mentioned, my name is Davia Prescott. My pronouns are she and hers, and I'm just really excited to be able to talk about this work with you all today. But before I do that, I do just want to say thank you to Lisa for your leadership and freedom and support to do this work, because it wouldn't have happened without that. And to our colleague, Christina Ishmael, as well, who's on our teaching, learning, and tech team, who is just the fiercest ally that I have in this work. And so without both of you to support me, this wouldn't be happening. So like Lisa said before, I don't know if I need to change this or not, before I start talking about the report and share what I've been thinking with you all, I just want to share a video that is from our friends in a school district called Beaverton, Oregon, which is right outside Portland. They are doing a lot of work around queer and trans inclusion in their district, and this video speaks to that. It's their students from their district. It's a little bit heart-wrenching. They're talking into the camera about what they need, but I think it will really serve to frame this conversation and set the tone for the panel conversation that we're going to have as well after. So without that, I was told to just say play, and that it would play magically. There we go. Great. Oh, spoiler alert.
Okay, video's rolling.
My name is Hale. I am in 6th grade. I use they, them pronouns, and I identify as queer.
My name's Nathan. I'm 18. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a transgender male.
Mi nombre es Sharon, identifico como asexual y mis pronuncios son ellos.
My name is Haley. I use they, them pronouns. I am panromantic and non-binary.
I am Ainsley, and I do not care what pronouns people call me, and I am very proud of my transgender parents.
I'm 18, my pronouns are he, him, I'm gay, and I don't feel comfortable saying my name. I don't feel comfortable saying my name because my dad is not very accepting, and I don't think I'm in any danger, but I don't want to risk anything that he may do if he were to find out that I'm gay.
I'm not really out to my classmates or teachers yet, only my close friends know and the people in the Gender Sexualities Alliance Club.
When I was in 3rd grade, my whole class found out that I was transgender, and most of the kids didn't really understand. Some just didn't want to do anything about it, and there was just one kid who just did not approve of any of that and decided to bully me because he did not understand me at all, which I did not appreciate.
When I was a freshman, I had a group of teenagers in my grade who would bully me, who would kick me and punch me, who would shove me against lockers, and I didn't even have a name to them. I was just homophobic slurs and a disease.
It made me very sad, and I cried. And I walked and I cried.
Sometimes some students could go into severe depression and might try and hurt themselves.
I was trying to come out as being lesbian, and I tried to tell a boy that was in my class, and he totally overreacted. He was yelling in my face and falling to the floor.
Still, it was really upsetting to me that my mere presence had caused people to get so upset.
For most of my education, I didn't even know I was gay. I just thought there was something weird and wrong with me that I couldn't pinpoint, so I just hid. Fortunately, I went to a school that was very accepting, and I was able to fully realize that I'm gay, and I was able to be out and open.
Walking through the hallways, I sometimes hear stuff like that, and it does make me feel unsafe from time to time. But the teachers here are very supportive, and it helps.
I had a 9th grade literature teacher who would stand up for me when I had insults thrown at me, when I got physical threats. She made sure that I felt safe, and to me that mattered the world. It mattered the entire world to me, because I felt like I was safe, I felt like my identity mattered, and that I mattered to her.
We're gonna support you, and we're going to be there for you no matter what. And I was like, oh, hell, man, that felt nice.
One advice I would give to teachers who are handling students who identify as LGBT+ is to simply let them express or show what they are feeling at that given moment, because they might not be able to express those feelings at home, and school should be a place where they should feel welcomed and safe at.
I need teachers to step in when students call me gay, even though I prefer being called pansexual.
I would try and keep it as gender neutral as possible. Despite if your class looks like all of them wouldn't be LGBT at all, you should never discriminate like that. You never know.
Like saying girls out the left, boys out the right, making them go their separate ways into two different doors. That's it makes people feel really uncomfortable, sort of, because it's forcing them to choose something that they're not.
I would really appreciate if teachers asked me my pronouns.
Share their pronouns.
My pronouns.
What pronouns they prefer.
In my health classes, I've never really felt included because the classes are more focused around straight relationships and cisgendered people.
In health class, I didn't feel included at all. I wouldn't have even known at that time that being gay was an actual valid thing.
So when I was in health, none of the topics that we were talking about really matched with how I had, what I experienced and how I saw the world. So it was aggravating, it was confusing, it left me feeling isolated.
I think these targets are so important because we want to create a new generation of kids and generation of queer kids who can feel safe, normal, and accepted for who they are.
Having a new education system is definitely something I've been looking forward to for a long time.
It makes me feel happy knowing that kids who are younger than me are going to get educated about this, because there are kids who identify as LGBT, and they need this resource and information so they know that they feel normal and valid.
It'll help people feel safe and like they're not alone in life and that they have support.
There are going to be kids who will walk out of health class and feel okay.
To all the teachers that are going to teach this LGBTQ knowledge and all this, thank you so much. It is really important to know that these things are normal and it's anything weird, just a little bit more special.
Thank you for supporting us in class and treating us like we belong and not like an oddity or something that's not supposed to be here.
I just want to thank all the teachers in advance for everything you're going to do. It might not seem like it's going to make a difference, but it really, really is going to. Thank you.
Thank you for what you're going to do for us. Thank you and have a great day.
So that is, hits pretty close to home, I think, for many of us in this room probably. But the moral of the story, as we were just saying, right, is that kids know. Students know what they need. It's not like we're just guessing about what we need to do. What we need to figure out is how to address these things, right? What the challenges are and how we address them. And so in that vein, if I can control this, TBD. Oh. All right, it even landed on the one that I was trying to make it land on. I'm excited to dive into the report and talk. I have 2 microphones, and I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about what I've been thinking about over the past year in this report, and how some of the things that I think shine through in that video show up in sort of a research and policy space. So I'll just sort of mention briefly that this work really came about through a working group of folks from all different sectors, not only education, but policy and advocacy and higher education and teacher colleges and youth-serving organizations, with the idea that we all have a piece of this puzzle, right? We can't just continue to sort of look inward to solve these problems that we're all working to address in some way or another. So we spent a lot of time this summer sort of thinking through these challenges and what this looks like in different capacities, and sort of arrived at these sort of framing issues and framing and solutions that I'm going to offer in the report. So just a kind of a quick overview of what I will talk about. First, I'll just start with why queer inclusion, right? What do we mean when we say queer inclusion? Why now? Why are we thinking about this, and what's the urgency? What does it look like in practice, right? What do inclusive teaching and learning practices actually look like in the classroom or in other learning environments? And then I'll talk a little bit about open educational resources, right? What is OER, and how can it help address some of the challenges that we've uncovered in this? And then lastly, just offer some next steps for research and researchers and teachers and school administrators. Before I dive into that, I do just want to make a note on the language that I use in this work and that I'll use in this conversation. This is kind of a 101 overview that I use when I travel outside of queer spaces, where I am having to sort of give more of a 101 level of this. But I will just mention that I use queer and trans interchangeably with LGBTQ in this work, primarily for the sake of not having to recite that string of letters over and over, and also because people have different versions of that string of letters, right? I usually take a moment to just acknowledge the difference between gender minorities and sexual minorities, especially in terms of how they're policed in school, how they're legislated, and how they're sort of baked into school policies and classroom rules. I think the rest of those things cover it, right? I usually spend a moment with folks who are not in this space really talking about the difference between trans and non-binary and cisgender, because I don't ever want to move into this conversation assuming that folks think those are all the same thing, right? Oh. Great, all right. So why queer inclusion, right? Why are we talking about this now? There are a lot of reasons to talk about this now, right? But the 3 things that I have up here are sort of the big buckets that I see for the context for this conversation and this work, and for where we see it sort of playing out around the country. The first is culturally responsive teaching, right? And I myself have learned a lot about this from our colleague, Lisa mentioned, Jenny Muniz, who has done lots of really great work on culturally responsive teaching. But it's this idea, right, that students unique experiences and backgrounds should be thought of as a lever in their learning, right, as opposed to a deficit. And the experiences and identities of queer and trans students fit pretty squarely into that. The second is the sort of just increasing awareness generally, societally, of LGBTQ people and identities and the challenges that they face. And I only really have anecdotal evidence for this, but if we're talking about materials specifically, which we are in this report, I think it's pretty clear. Right? If we looked back 5 years ago from right now and thought about the number of inclusive teacher professional learning resources or student-facing resources that existed that were inclusive of queer and trans identities, it would be so many fewer than exist right now. And then lastly, despite this, right, according to GLSEN Research, who's the largest organization that puts out a biannual survey of queer and trans students, outcomes for some students are actually getting worse, right? Something we run up a lot against in this work is this idea that the world is just kind of generally becoming more progressive, and so if we do nothing, eventually LGBTQ students will just kind of be okay, right? And that's just not the case. It's just gonna like take one back and then go back forward every time. So a book I cite in this work a lot is a book by Michael Sadowski called Safe is Not Enough. As you might guess from the title, it's really just about this idea that providing only basic physical human protections for students in school is not enough, right, to engage them fully and to improve educational outcomes. And so I argue in this that instructional materials play a really important part in this. Not only student-facing materials, right, but teacher-facing ones as well. And we see really this increasing number of student-facing materials that are inclusive as a bellwether for the opportunity for teacher-facing materials as well, right? Because the more materials there are for students, the more we're going to need to prepare teachers to teach this content when it is LGBTQ-focused content, but even when it's not, to be prepared to have these conversations with students, right, and engage them in these ways and validate them in these ways. And the second one is just to note that this goes beyond just curriculum and what's taught in queer history, right? In sex ed, it goes into how teachers use language in the classroom, the rules that they have in the classroom, like I think was referenced in the video, just the assumptions that they make and the level of awareness of their own identities and how it affects the way that they move through the world and engage with students in the classroom. And then the last one, if you take nothing else away, I don't know which microphone I'm using for you. If you take nothing else away from this, take away this. The principal and school leader support is crucial to this work. I talk to teachers all the time who are willing and ready to do this work, even though they're so strapped for time and resources, they're still really wanting to do this work, but they're afraid they're gonna get fired, or maybe not so dramatic as that, microaggressed, or then seen as the gay expert in their school and will have to then just do everything for this effort perpetually, right? Having actual substantive and active principal and school leader support is really, really key. So what does this look like, right? What are we talking about when we say inclusive learning environments? I really see this as a large responsibility of the teacher with the right supports, right? And the way that teachers are prepared to do this is through adequate teacher professional learning. And the sort of entryway into that is the materials that we're preparing teachers with, right? And so when I think about inclusive teacher-facing materials, I'm thinking about ones that explain to teachers what LGBTQ identities are, right, just at a pretty basic level, what challenges that students, particularly transgender students and non-binary students face, because again, I think this is one of the least understood things by folks outside of the community. Pronoun use, right, why it matters, why you should make an effort, why it's important to students, and how it sort of fits into this, this whole idea of inclusion and creating inclusive environments. And then the last one is the fallacies of allyship. And this is a really big one for me because I hear teachers say a lot, we were just talking about this morning, what can I do to make sure that students know that I'm someone they can come talk to? And I think the most common response to that is those little safe space stickers, right? I don't know if probably you're familiar with them. They're just little rainbow stickers that say safe space. Teachers can put them in classrooms or in windows. And I never say those because there's no insurance for students that teachers are actually prepared to have those conversations, right? Even if their intent is really good, those can be really intense and personal conversations with students, and there's no, those stickers don't come with any, preparation for teachers to actually have those conversations. And so I think helping teachers understand what allyship doesn't look like is just as important as what it does look like, right? It doesn't look like only supporting the white queer kids in your class. It doesn't look like supporting trans students sometimes, but also still using really gendered language in your class, right? It doesn't look like all these things, so I think that's a really important part as well. And so having materials to help teachers understand all of these things, right, helps them create inclusive learning environments. And these are ones that are classrooms, right, libraries, informal settings, really any sort of learning environment that you might be thinking about, formal or informal, that help all students feel safe and confident, help all students know that they have an ally, right, help allies exist and help students know that they have the ally, and ensure that all students are represented both in the classroom and in the curriculum. This is changing by itself now, it's magical. So this is a lot, right? Like this is a lot to do, and teachers already have no time and no funding. So what's keeping us from doing this, right? If it were so easy, we would just be doing it and it would be fine. Seems like a long list when it's up here, but these are some of the challenges that I see as some of the biggest barriers and reasons, right, why we aren't implementing all of these things. The first is, like I mentioned, just an increasing number of student-facing materials and still so little preparation for teachers and helping them understand all of it. A lack of support from school administration, again, don't forget to take that away. School administration is key, support. A lack of knowledge of existing resources, right? We talked to a lot of teachers who are creating their own resources, and they're really great resources, but they're doing that because they feel like they have to reinvent the wheel because they don't see these resources existing anywhere else. An inability to share those resources, right? Teachers, again, so often the ones we talk to just think that they're the only people looking for these, and so they create them for themselves and they hold on to them, and then the next person looking for these resources also recreates them and holds on to them themselves. There's no way to adapt and update existing resources for folks using proprietary inclusive materials. They're just written into textbooks, right? Or other proprietary materials that you can't take and change and adapt. And then the last one is just pretty straightforward. The cost of doing this can be a lot for schools. So what is OER, right? Before I sort of launch into making a case for how it could happen, how it could help here, I just want to explain it a little bit. I think it's still sort of a nascent idea to a lot of folks, even in the education space. So open educational resources are materials that are free to retain, revise, reuse, remix, and redistribute, right? We call these the 5 R's of OER. And these are different, these sort of 5 characteristics that are up here are different, distinguish them from materials that are just free and materials that are proprietary, right? With proprietary materials, textbooks, and other sort of copyrighted content, you can't just download it without paying for it, usually. You can't retain it, you can't adapt it and edit and revise it and then share it back out, right? You can't do any of those things. You can buy it and you can read it yourself. And even with free resources, which I would argue are most of the inclusive resources for teaching that exist out there, right? GLSEN, Teaching Tolerance, Gender Spectrum, all have sort of free resources online, which are great, except that teachers can't take them and do anything with them, right? They can share links to them, and that's the extent of it. They can't customize them for their needs or their students or their staff. So how could OER help, right? Again, the first one is pretty straightforward. Cost sharing, long-term cost savings for school districts. And this is the case regardless, really, of which OER you're using. But I put it up here because sort of eliminating that giant textbook cost for schools means just one less barrier, right, that schools have when thinking about inclusion work. The second one is adaptability, and I think that's the biggest piece of OER for me in terms of thinking about inclusion. I think the ability to adapt resources is really critical when we're talking about marginalized identities specifically, because when we do see examples of queer and trans representation in proprietary textbooks and teacher prep materials, by no coincidence, it's the least marginalized voice of a marginalized population, right? And so for For queer representation, that usually looks like white cisgender male narratives, right? And we see that in more and more, we're seeing it in student-facing materials, right? In textbooks and in YA literature and kids literature. And that's it. And then that's checked. That's the queer and trans inclusion. And then we're moving on. And that, of course, doesn't even begin to describe the nuance of this entire community and population of people, right? So I think that ability to adapt is really important for OER. And aside from that, just the ability of teachers to recognize that the identities of their students don't exist in a vacuum, right? And so having freely accessible, adaptable materials that teachers could take and tailor, again, to the populations in their school would just create an opportunity that is not there right now through textbooks or other copyrighted material. The last one is just shareability, right? Again, teachers are just reinventing the wheel because they feel like they have to. And this is maybe okay for teachers who feel prepared to do this, but it's especially problematic for teachers who want to do this and have no idea where to start, right? So if we gave teachers a place to start, that could really help sort of expedite this work in a way that was both iterative and allowed folks to sort of own their own narratives as they're sharing them out. So the last one I'll just end on. These are some of the next steps that I offer in the report, and I think we're going to mention them in the conversation as well, but I'll just mention them here. For researchers, we just need more data on queer and trans students, right? The GLSEN survey that is put out every other year is so important and is a really, really good start, but there's so much more data that's needed on students' experiences and queer teachers' experiences as well, because they're often the ones who are taking on this work in their schools. For school leaders, again, we just need to make it clear that teachers aren't going to lose their jobs for taking on this work. And more than that, they also need to be actively supported and engaged. And I say that there's a low barrier of entry to this work, and I believe that that's true, but like all equity work, it will eventually take a reallocation of resources. And that's something that is a pretty uncomfortable reality for a lot of school and district leaders. And lastly, just educators, right? I always encourage folks to start with themselves, start thinking about their own identities and how it affects the ways that they engage with students and move through the world and through their schools. And then lastly, just consider OER, because I think there are a lot of possibilities there for inclusion specifically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabia. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I'm just really thrilled that we here at New America can be a place to open up this discussion and be at least one area where we can have these conversations and just really think forward. So I'm now going to introduce our moderator for the discussion today. I'm thrilled for many reasons to have Brandon Tinsley here with us. Brandon, as many of you might know, was here with us at New America as associate editor just about a year ago or so. He's now a national political writer at CNN, covering the intersection of culture and politics. And he is also was the co-host of Slate Magazine's Outward podcast and a contributing writer at Pacific Standard Magazine. So I'm going to let Brandon come on up, and then he'll introduce the rest of our panel. Thanks so much, Brandon.
All right. Should I do it here to introduce them? Is that fine? Okay. So thank you, Lisa, for the very lovely introduction. Today we have Jabari Lyles. Jabari is the LGBTQ Affairs Liaison of the Office of the Mayor in Baltimore City. He is a former elementary and middle school teacher and the former executive director of the Maryland chapter of GLSEN, which, as Sabia mentioned, is an organization that advocates for LGBTQ students in K-12 schools. So, Jabari. And then we have Allison Leppard, who is an educator working in Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland. She runs an LGBTQ club for middle school students and is working on creating a professional development for teachers around LGBTQ equity. So, Allison. And then Sabia. Cool. So we only have, I think, like 45 minutes for the discussion. So I want to go ahead and jump right in. Allison, I will actually start with you. So Sabia just gave us this really tremendous presentation. And I'm wondering, Allison, if you could sort of give us a little bit of personal dimension to this and tell us what does LGBTQ inclusion, what does it mean from the perspective of the classroom, and what does it look like? Why is it important?
So you summarized it so well, I felt like I wasn't going to have anything left to say. So, oh, good, this is working. So I am a science teacher, and so I think when I started this, I thought, well, there's not a lot I can do in my classroom because I'm not doing like LGBTQ history, or I'm not doing literature, or I don't teach health. But I have learned, that the way I use language, the way I used to call my students ladies and gentlemen, I don't do that anymore. And I also realize the way I talk, I can make sure that I'm not assuming that they're straight. Like if I'm saying to boys, like, well, if you're straight, then you might get married, to a woman someday. We're talking about like periods, actually. And so you might need to know about this. But using that kind of language, like if you're straight, or calling everybody period 5 or period 6, that makes a big difference. The other thing that I'm doing really actively is I'm calling out the kids when they use gay as an insult. And I do that very publicly because I feel like everybody's heard it, and so everybody's going to hear my response to it. And they're like, no, I'm joking. So you really have to be ready to have those conversations. You have to be comfortable having those conversations. And then by running the club, we've really elevated just the presence of LGBTQ students in the school. The kids, depending on the year, sometimes they may have posters all over the place, and sometimes then they'd come back with comments, or they'd say, hey, my math teacher divided us into boys and girls to do problems. So I said, okay, you know what, I'm going to send out an email, and let's just remind everybody that you can't divide people into boys and girls. So it's having that, the small things that you do make a big difference, but then also having that place where they know you can come to you and say, look, this is a problem, how do we address it? And it's something that it's built over time. I've been running this club for 5 years. I've changed a lot about what I do in those 5 years, and then the school's changed a lot in those 5 years, but I will say, I have extremely supportive administration. So when we've gotten pushback, like one year we did the morning announcements, we had an LGBTQ person of the day, and those morning announcements go out to parents. And so when they got a little pushback from that, the principal's like, it's LGBTQ History Month, so what do you expect? So you have to have that. You cannot do it in a vacuum. And if the parents are going to push back at all, we had a rainbow flag in the front hall. Now it's moved. It's still there. But somebody came in, all hot and bothered about the rainbow flag, and the principal said, "That's our flag." So you have to have those multiple layers, and it takes time. It takes time to develop the skill. It takes time to develop the knowledge.
I'm really interested in the club, especially because you just said this, and Sabia also reiterated it during her presentation, but the importance of support, administrative support, teacher support. How did the club start? Was it sort of a solo effort? Was it something that...
Well, we had a club, and the teacher who ran it moved, and she ran it at lunch. And I don't really know how that works because the kids have different lunches. And I understand, you don't all want to give up your afternoon. So when she moved, the principal said, anybody want to do the club? And I said, I'll do it. And that's because my kids are very, just in the queer community. And so I felt like, okay, sure, no problem. But I did it after school. And I put up a sign, and I thought, I have no idea whether anybody's going to come. I just put signs around the school, and then one boy came, and he brought all of his friends. And then, like I said, we've been a pretty big presence some years. We made a lot of posters. We actually did a skit called "Why Are There So Many Posters?" because I would hear the kids who weren't in the club like, "Why are there so many posters about this club?" But and we put that on the morning TV show, another good vehicle for educating the community. But and it's varied year by year. Last year we had a pretty small showing, and this year we have a really strong one. So it really just depends on who's in the school at the moment.
Jabari, I know you were also a teacher for years, but could you tell us what does this work look like on your end of things in the role that you have now?
Yeah, so I've moved on from teaching and gone into the advocacy policy government realm. And in my work, it's really challenging these large systems to be bold and proactive about this work and really holding them accountable to doing it visibly. When a lot of these systems, they either piecemeal or they tiptoe into the work. And when you do that, you re-perpetuate these tropes of this closeted nature of our community. And you heard those kids. They know exactly who they are. And if they're going to live every day and be bold about their identity, then it should be there in our expectation for our leaders to do the same. So I'm really looking forward to government, school districts, and agencies to really take this head on and not to be piecemeal about it.
And this is a question for both of you, but what are, Allison, you mentioned some of these, but what are some of the biggest challenges? We can start with you, Jabari, and then we can get back to Allison. But when you're trying to be more inclusive in the classroom for your LGBTQ students, what's the major pushback that you often get?
For me, number one, teachers really do need this education around just who are we as LGBTQ people? We're still living through the tropes and the stereotypes and the harm of media and things that have happened all through the years. And so when I go to classrooms and schools to teach teachers, a lot of it is about demystifying the languages and unlearning some of the stuff that they've learned for so long. And even as educators, as people who are caring for children, those deep-seated notions and those unconscious biases, they come up as a teacher. And so that's always the first part. I always say that we build competency and comfort with this topic by just being able to talk about the words. I always say that saying words like lesbian and gay and bisexual, these are not bad words, but we treat them like bad words in middle school, and so desensitized. Yeah, it's just like this person's gay.
Especially bisexual. Like,
right? Yeah.
Handle that
Can't
term.
form their lips to say these words, and so I think that's number one, is just sort of desensitizing and defining the words and working against the miseducation that has happened. And then after that, teachers need real strategies. So we can't just define LGBTQ and then throw teachers in the classroom and think that they know what real inclusion looks like. So ongoing professional development, really intense and thoughtful training and coaching are some of the things that I think teachers really need, because honestly, the kids are okay. The kids are okay.
So one of the challenges is preparing teachers to handle. So the pronouns uses can be easy, and not making assumptions, about people's gender or sexuality. But say you are going to teach LGBTQ history, it's one thing to be a teacher who willingly goes into that, but they're now putting that into the Montgomery County curriculum, which is fantastic for, I think it's 9th grade. And that means every 9th grade history teacher needs to be prepared to have those conversations. And that's a different thing. So it's like, how can you create a space where we're going to talk about queer history, and the kids aren't going to erupt into, whatever kind of teasing or laughter. And so I think that's the thing. It's like, it's one thing for you to say certain things like, these are my pronouns, but it's another thing to prepare the classroom to have those conversations. And that's a much higher level, like Jabari's talking about ongoing. So we start with the 101, but we do have to build that capacity, and I think that's going to take some time.
And we've talked a lot about the importance of language, and Sabia, feel free to jump in before we get to the OER part. We talked a lot about the importance of language, and one thing I'm curious about is, have anyone on the stage, have you ever sort of run into maybe intergenerational issues with language? Just as an example, like recently, I know that I, for instance, I use queer frequently. To me, it's not a slur. I did not come up at a time when that was a pejorative term. But I have a lot of older gay friends who, when they grew up, that was a slur. They personally don't use it. Have you run into any sort of stickier sort of issues using language and getting people to sort of understand the history and the power of the language?
I think the intergenerational thing mostly is between the 12-year-olds in my classroom and my colleagues. I mean, that's like the generational thing. But a very interesting meeting we had, so I'm working with the Equity Office on developing LGBTQ professional development. And so we've had stakeholder meetings, and one was with a group of teachers of all ages, but all who identify as queer. One was a music teacher, and said a boy had come up perceived boy had come up and said, "Can I wear a dress at the concert?" And it's like, "Oh, well, no, I'm not gonna, we can't do that." And the younger teachers are like, we should talk about that response. And so, this is even a person who, identifies as queer, but not being familiar with maybe the gender variance and how it should be handled, just someone who's been teaching for 30, 40 years. So that has been a really big change in MCPS in terms of our policy around gender, and the people who've been teaching for a long time, well, maybe even people who've been new, don't know that much about it, and so there is that whole level of teaching that needs to happen as well. Just what are our policies? How should these things be handled?
In my experience, there's been a lot of discomfort around the evolution and the availability of the language. And so during teacher trainings, I may hear some of my more elder teachers say, well, in my day, you were just gay or lesbian. And then now there's LGBTQIA, kitchen sink, flower pot, all these different things. And they fail to recognize that these concepts have been around forever. And queer identity is not new. What's new are these pretty words that we have to describe them. And these words are becoming more in vogue, and they're coming up in our discourse more often. And with the advent of the internet, these young people know these words like the back of their hands. But I always tell teachers is that your charge is not to be a walking glossary. That's my job. I got to do that. Your charge is to be open to the concepts. And when I give a training, I want you to be more aware of your students' gender and your students' sexuality. But I think the real treasure is to become more aware of your gender and your sexuality and how these words also apply to you.
Davia, do you?
Yeah, this is something the majority of the time that I spend talking about this work is with folks who are, one, significantly older than I am, and two, outside of this community, right, because of the nature of think tank work at conferences that are not specifically focused around queer students. And this has been exactly what you described, especially with the word queer, has been my experience in almost all of those conversations, right? And either I'm standing up on a stage and talking like I was right now, and I look out into the audience and people are like, what is happening? or people are into it so much that afterwards they want to process with me all of the things on the ways that they feel about the words that I just used on a pretty personal level, which is one, is never the invitation, and two, is not something that I had foreseen maybe before this work, before I started doing this work, and a lot of it is intergenerational. Again, especially with the word queer, and I personally feel like there's like a set of language that I use with my friends who share all of the same language. There's a set that I use here in a professional, pretty progressive space, and then there's a set that I use when I'm talking to people who have never engaged with this before. And switching back and forth between those is something that I've had to learn how to negotiate that I hadn't really anticipated before.
So we do the same thing in the club. Well, first of all, for the PD that I'm working in, professional development, we're not going to use the word queer. Like, it's just too complicated. Like, we're just not going to go there. And we were making our slide for the terms. We didn't include all of them, just like you didn't include all of them. It's like, what can we deal with? And then sometimes the students, they want to make a poster explaining everything, and I'm like, let's just start with the basics. Like, I don't know if the whole school is ready for all of this. So we'll have very different conversations in the club than we might put outside of the club. So yeah, we're doing that constantly.
Yeah, and that reminds me of just a couple months ago, I was writing something, and it was about sort of a queer reading of somebody, and in the headline of the piece I proposed using the word queer, and it sort of started this entire conversation where people were just like, oh, like, I don't know if we really use that, like, are people comfortable with it? And I was like, whoa, this is not a conversation I thought I would have in the year of our Lord 2019. But then it actually did make me sort of like step back, and I was like, oh, it'll be fine. And then like immediately after the piece went up, I got an email from this older guy who was just like, Brandon, I want you to know that it is never, ever acceptable to use the word queer to talk about somebody. And I was just like, what? But it made me sort of think about the sort of how short LGBTQ history is, and how there is so much overlap between what sort of people of one generation are comfortable with using, the only sort of terminology that they know, versus people for whom it's sort of shifting pretty radically. So sort of pivoting to OER, Sabi, I'm actually glad that you didn't spend too much time talking about it in your presentation, because I would love for you to sort of break it down a little bit more for us, specifically in the LGBTQ context. If you have any sort of examples of what the power of OER, what it can do, what it looks like for LGBTQ students and teachers trying to promote that work.
Yeah, absolutely. For a little bit of context, there was a pre-K-12 education specialist, I think is her title, Bill Njama, who is one of our partners in this work at Creative Commons USA, who's based in American University, who unfortunately has the flu, otherwise she would be here with us. But I want to mention her because I'm not the only person who talks about OER. I am the only person without the flu who's talking about OER. But I think some important context for this is that, like we were talking just before this, I was with a group of OER folks a couple weeks ago, this sort of big annual conference of open education, and it was my second time attending that conference. And last year when I attended it the first time, and I was talking about this and sort of just feeling out the field and engaging people's responses to this topic and talking about open licensing and queer inclusion, which the crux of my work has been just building that bridge between these two things in people's minds, because it's not an obvious connection. When I was first doing that last year, again, folks were just like blank faces. They had no idea what I was talking about. The OER world was like, what does this have to do with open licensing? And queer and trans advocates were like, why are you talking about that and not talking about like bathroom bills, right? And so just it has been so clear to me that we all, even all of us on the stage who, again, work in sort of different capacities but towards the same end, have different pieces of this puzzle and understand it in slightly different ways that would be helpful if we came together. And so that was really my thinking around connecting the dots between queer and trans inclusion work and open licensing and copyright law. So far, it's for a very long time, it was like if I graphed it, it would be nothing, 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 no one was interested in it, and then all of a sudden people are like, yeah, okay, this is great. And this year, when we went back to that conference, there were a lot of folks talking about this. There's about to be the first queer studies textbook that's openly licensed for higher education, which is a pretty cool thing. There are more people talking about it in K-12. And so it's, I think, these sort of emerging pathways for OER is becoming something that people are more and more aware of, at least in the OER space. I think much more slowly outside of OER and furthermore outside of education, but people are ready for it, right? Ultimately, open education is an equity tool, right? At the very base of it, it is a tool to get more resources into the hands of more students. And with this work, we want to make sure that those resources that are out there are gaining traction, are getting into the hands of more students and more teachers, are inclusive, because it's going to be a really missed opportunity if they're not.
And have either of you sort of used it, sort of tapped into the power of OER in your own work?
I have not, but I'm intrigued by this idea, this of resources out there that are modifiable, which I think is fantastic, because like I'll be looking for materials and sometimes I'm like, I'll find something that looks interesting, but it's like an 8-day lesson. I'm like, I don't have time for an 8-day lesson. So the fact that there would be a place to go to find resources when you want to do something, it's pretty daunting to start something from scratch. And you do want to know what people have tried, what has worked. And so I think that would, like you said, it would really move things along. If people had an idea, they didn't have time to do it on their own, which very few of us do. So.
Yeah, teaching is the hardest job I've ever had, and teachers need resources. And I'm lucky enough right now to teach part-time high school LGBT studies, which is a part-time elective that high school students can take. And when I announced that I was teaching that class, I got so many emails from other educators just saying, can I see your syllabus? That's all they wanted, was just to see the syllabus. They didn't even want my materials or anything else, and there was such a real thirst for this sharing of knowledge and sharing materials. And so it's really exciting to think about how OER can address some of those things.
Yeah, Davia, have you, in your own research, have you sort of seen what works well, what doesn't work well, what people are more interested in, like some sorts of materials or discussions? Is it sort of we just need help, like the service level stuff versus I have a few students who could really benefit from knowing more about this, and I can't help them unless like I know more about it. But yeah, do you have any examples of sort of how it looks?
My answer is that I would love to have examples, but there are no, At the moment, there are no openly licensed teacher professional learning materials that are inclusive that I'm aware of, and for sure. They might exist out there, but I have spent 2.5 years now actively looking for them, and teachers don't have 2.5 years. So if I can't find them in that amount of time, then something is wrong, right? And there's something that we need to fix. It's more, that is a challenge of this work too, because I'm at once explaining what OER is, offering it as a solution, convincing people that LGBTQ inclusion is important, and then also I don't have any examples to point to. And they're like, great, show me where they are. And I'm like, you go, create them. The conversations that have been most promising are folks like the folks in Beaverton, right, who created the video, who have created these materials, and they're really great materials. And my colleague Christina and I were talking with them, and we said, would you be willing to openly license them? And they said, what does that mean? And I think that is the next step, and I think it's pretty low-hanging fruit at this point. People just don't know what OER is and what it can do. And so sort of spreading that awareness is I think going to be the real tangible next step in this, because there's a lot that, like you were saying, that both of you, that teachers want to be able to do, and maybe take pieces of different things to tailor them to the needs of their classroom and their students and other teachers in their schools, and just can't do that with proprietary materials. So that's sort of where we see this going next, is to start creating some of these materials that people are starting to see the vision for.
And I mean, Jabari, what you were just saying, this kind of reminds me of, I spend more time than I would like on Twitter, but I follow a lot of academics who either are LGBTQ or sort of teach sort of like queer literature or something like that. And it's fascinating because you see a lot of them sort of just posting their syllabus, or they will ask people like, I'm teaching a freshman seminar. Do you guys have ideas about the first things that we should read? It's for a freshman class, it's for a senior class. But the sort of, like you're saying, like the appetite that people actually have for sharing, especially people who are just like clawing out of the trenches, are just like, I've been doing this work and I want to give it life. But it's fascinating how much you can learn just from seeing what other people have done. I guess this is my inner cynic, or maybe judicious optimist, sort of jumping out. So like it makes sense to me how OER is meaningful and effective in a sort of administrative or technical way, right? Like it equals access. It makes it possible for people who might not have the time or the resources or just the knowledge to sort of attain certain resources. I'm curious as to what you, what we, what everyone can do to address challenges that sort of go beyond the sort of the material, the curricula aspect of it. So, for example, I'm from South Carolina, one of, I think, 5 states that still has no promo homo laws. So in South Carolina, so in that context at least, you're not allowed to teach about LGBTQ issues sort of outside the context of STIs, which, I mean, you can imagine how stigmatizing, how that mischaracterizes what LGBTQ means. But I'm curious about like what can we do to sort of push back against, or to address, or to correct these sort of deeper cultural this resistance to teaching LGBTQ issues. You know, there's the classroom side, there's the advocacy side, but what does any of this look like broadly? This is for everyone.
I want to give a shout out to parent advocacy because in Montgomery County, I mean, you know, and people are like, oh, Montgomery County is all liberal, you know, but it's taken a lot of work, and I think there's someone here who would agree with that. But it needs to come from all sides. So like I said, I have a supportive administrator, but you know, so teachers need to seek out administrators and feel them out about that, maybe start educating their administrators. But parents, if you're wishing your school system is different, you can be that person who is going and talking to them and explaining why, and providing the data and doing the push and finding, I mean, I think there's a big role for that. Parents' voices weigh heavily on a school district. especially if they feel like they're a good school district, then they're going to feel like they have to keep up their, their reputation amongst the parents and keep them happy. So there is a very big role for that. I feel like it has to come from all directions. It has to be top down, it has to be bottom up, and it has to be from, sort of the outside of the system too.
Yeah, I agree that there are multiple touch points. Something that I've definitely learned doing policy work, doing LGBT education policy work in Maryland, is it's very different than me showing up to a board meeting in Cecil County and saying, do this work, versus a real constituent or a parent or a student doing some of that work. So I think that we have to be empowering families and students to be advocates. And that includes some of that good old advocacy and organizing education. And I think it's also about, like, who do we put up at the mic? There's a real thirst in LGBT work to continue to reveal the narratives of Black people, of brown people, of trans people. And so if we're going to design these resources that are culturally relevant, those folks need to be at the table in designing them and leading that cause and shaping their own stories. And some of that work is done at the school board, at the school meeting, but some of that good advocacy work is also done at the GSA meeting, and like teaching kids what it means to stand up for themselves and demand that their school leaders do this work.
I think at the sort of research and policy think tank level, so much of this work exists in the middle, but so much of the focus is on the margins. And by that I mean, when I start talking about this work, people are always assuming that I'm like going to those 6 states where teachers aren't allowed to say this in the classroom, right? And people are like standing up with pitchforks and like herding us out of the building. That's not the case. And I wouldn't voluntarily go to those places for one. Or like we're in districts like San Diego Unified, which has 2 people full-time who are focused on doing this work, and everyone is just like, I don't know, there's some vision that everyone's just like gay and happy and it's great. And that's not the majority of people either, right? It's these conversations in generally kind of quote-unquote progressive spaces where people are open to this but maybe not so familiar or comfortable with it, but willing to learn more. But there's still a lot of work to do, and our conversations are always sort of at this 101 level and never pushes past that to really think about what this actually looks like and what anti-racist queer inclusion looks like and what trans inclusion looks like and how to do it and how not to do it. That's really my biggest challenge in this, and I think the challenge of other folks who are in this sort of, in similar organizations, maybe thinking about this, is that people think it's this extreme one end or the other, and it's really not. There's so much gray area right in the middle of people trying to figure this out, and it's sort of helping people move through that space that's hardest.
God, that kind of reminded me of when I taught for a year in Germany it was essentially like a middle school and high school, and we were doing a lesson on just sort of like American high school culture. And one of because they were just like, do you have cheerleaders, football players? What does that mean? I remember there was this one student whose English wasn't that great, and so he was just like, what's that one city where everyone is like really gay and it's really great? And I was just like, what are we talking about? And then this girl who was sitting next to him was just like, I think he means San Francisco. And so it was sort of like wild to me that like these sort of extremes also exist, have been exported literally to other countries across oceans in a way that was just like, oh, this is a great chance for us to talk about like why that is actually not true in the way that you think it is. Anyway, but like those are the sort of questions that I have. I would love to sort of open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions for our esteemed panelists.
There's a microphone if
you
do.
Hi, I'm Sue Klein from the Feminist Majority. I was interested in your comments that it was so hard to find or the resources in the open resources that you can modify. Do organizations like AFT and NEA in their lessons just not label it, or do they not have it? For federal resources on school materials? Do they have policies that exclude it? What's the story there? It seems like you should be able to find it. What have you been searching and finding?
You should indeed, I agree. Yes, I mean, the answer is yes. They have resources, right? A lot of them do, to varying degrees of quality, in my opinion. But they're free, right? And a lot of them are free. None of them are open, at least not ones that I've found yet. And again, that distinction, right, is whether folks can download them, retain them, edit, and adapt them, and then share them back out into the world. It turns out the federal government doesn't like when you do that to the resources that they put out there. And neither do a lot of other organizations who are doing this work. And I think part of that is, again, just because folks are not aware of OER, for one, and for two, people have a lot of hesitations, especially when we're talking about marginalized communities and identities and voices, right? Putting out materials into the world that anyone could take and do anything they want with. And that's a drawback of this, for sure. That's a risk. My answer to that is always that people who are wanting to use information about the queer community sort of with malicious intent are not waiting on OER to do that, right? They could just do that at any point. What they don't already have are inclusive materials and accurate information. But I think, to go back to your question, I think that that's a big piece of why the resources that we don't see, even a lot of what we put out here at New America, I mean, on our team, we were just talking about this morning, we openly license everything that we create, in part because we believe in it, and in part because our funder tells us to. But a lot of even the work that we produce here at New America is not openly licensed, right? It's free. You can go online and you can find it, and you can share it around, but you can't edit it. You can't take it and adapt it and then share it back out with a license and credit us. And that's the real key there. And so, yes, there are resources, but so few that are open.
Hi, my name is Rebecca York, and I'm here representing SMILE. We do LGBTQ youth work, but also teacher and admin, professional development, and ongoing support. My question is, a couple times it's been mentioned in passing, needing to expand the conversation. A lot of the work in educating around LGBTQ identities is about expanding the conversation and getting teachers to dive into their own identities to better understand how they can show up as allies. But it sounds like what we're sort of dancing around saying is that what we're teaching is the concept of intersectionality and privilege, and how those interact when someone is a teacher with students or a school administrator with staff. How do you see the open education resources around LGBTQ identities potentially changing the game for how we frame conversations around privilege in schools?
I think virtually just by who has access to author the content that goes in OER, right? When you think about who has access to authoring the content that goes into textbooks, it's very few people, and again, by no coincidence, people who are all privileged in many ways, right? And who are there and whose content that they write are characterized by the privilege that they hold personally and professionally. And with OER and the chance for anyone to create this content, to share it around, to collaborate on it, really, right? And then to have it used by other people, one provides people with access, again, to author that content, which just itself provides, a larger sort of plethora of voices in this space, and means that folks who are receiving this content and using it and then spreading it around to other teachers and in their classroom and sharing it with students means that those students who are using those materials don't just have sort of a singular lens of what this community looks like and the challenges that we face, right? I think there are a lot of things that would come up if sort of any cross-section really of this community sat down and examined the content that was in proprietary textbooks around this. I think there would be a lot missing there, right? And so OER just sort of offers the opportunity to address that.
I guess I would also say that you know, we all learned history, but whose history did we learn? And, you know, a lot of that work around learning about intersectionality and oppression is learning about what has already happened. And so when we understand that a lot of the history lessons that are currently being taught to our young people are either wrong history or incomplete history. And so many people don't understand, you know, that sexuality and gender has been around forever, and how the intersection with gender and race influences a lot about how societies have constructed these ideas. This information is just not available in your average American US history class. You know, the fight for trans rights, the gender diversity in ancient Africa. You know, like, folks aren't talking about those things. So hopefully OER can address some of the void and some of the, I guess, the inadequacies that a lot of the history curricula currently offers.
Seems like a way to quite literally sort of rewrite the script, right? It's not there, so you fill it in with the knowledge that whoever is doing the writing at that time is able to provide.
The challenge is then also, right, on whom does the onus fall to do that and create that content, and then ensure that it's quality and accurate and not, again, created with malicious intent. And that also, again, is one of the challenges that the OER space, I think, is starting to think about.
Well, thank you for hosting this event. I am Tafaret Ani. I am a curriculum writer and teacher trainer at Montgomery County Public Schools, and I have the great privilege of rewriting American history for students, so they do get an accurate picture. And so one thing that I've been thinking about is if a resource is free but not OER, that doesn't stop any teacher in the world from using what they like from it, creating something for their own classroom. I mean, that's what we do. Teachers are beggars, stealers, and borrowers, right? And so what to me is really missing, and what might be a first step, is some sort of review or way to curate what's already out there on the web to separate what's good from what's not good, right? And I'm thinking like models like History Matters, you know, through Roy Rosenzweig, where he basically has this like encyclopedia of the history on the web, and he goes through websites for all these topics and gives reviews about what it can be used for, what resources are there, what's good. That would be an amazing first place to start, right? Because just thinking about all these separate narratives and books, you know, like the Zinn Education Project has lessons that are specifically tailored. California's new curriculum under the FAIR Act is out online, right? I've definitely gone and read their 11th grade U.S. history to see what they're doing over there. So I think a first step, you know, since OER materials aren't really there, is just really give teachers like a curated list of what are the good places to go in terms of free places, because teachers are going to modify it and they are going to recycle and use it in their classroom, even if it's not technically for that purpose. So I was just like wondering, is that a plan that you guys have to put out, you know, what the best on the web for LGBTQ inclusion?
I mean, it sounds like you got a plan for it. So. No, yes, I think that's a great place to start. And a lot of teachers I talk to don't even know what GLSEN is, or don't even know where to look. Don't know that California has passed that law and are now beginning to implement textbooks that have that. And they, despite the fact that they're a Go Open state, they went entirely with proprietary textbooks, which in my opinion was a significant missed opportunity. But they do have the framework, which I'm sure you're familiar with. If you looked at that online, it's like 40,000 pages long. But if you're willing to look through it, in my opinion, it's really high quality, right? It starts in second grade, I think, with talking about family trees and different types of family and family structures, and goes all the way up through history and sex ed in high school. I absolutely agree that sort of an index of what's already out there would be tremendously useful, and I think that's, again, what's missing between folks doing this work in different capacities to similar ends, but in parallel ways, right? There's the OER space, which has OER Commons, which is this immense repository of materials and resources, but none. I have searched things like LGBTQ, and nothing comes up. There are some things that come up, but they're actually not open. And people, you know, anyone can go there and look for it, but you have to know that it exists in the first place, right? Which I think not a lot of teachers do, because why would they, right? And I think the same is true for a lot of queer and trans inclusive resources, that even teachers, again, who are actively out there looking for them, don't know where to find them, don't know that they're out there. So this is actually something we've been talking about in our
And
work.
the same thing for professional development. I
Yeah,
mean, if
absolutely.
you're developing professional development, I mean, it is fairly new that we're developing all this. And I know that, Human Rights Campaign has some and GLSEN has some. But is there a clearinghouse for what people have made? And
Where should these materials live, and then who owns them, right? And how do we curate them?
And stuff exists. It's not a ton, but stuff definitely does exist. I mean, just this morning, I used an incredible resource from GLSEN called Unheard Voices, which is a partnership between GLSEN and the Anti-Defamation League. And they're like these recordings of folks that were involved in the LGBT rights movement. And that was great, because today my lesson was on the HIV and AIDS epidemic. But last week we talked about queer representation in media, and you have Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet, who talks a lot about white, gay, and lesbian representation, and that's it. And so I'd love to be able to have an OER version of Vito Russo's Celluloid Closet to weave in and out of the great stuff that he says about queer representation, but also include Black and brown and trans and indigenous and different abilities as well. So I think that that's what some of the opportunities of OER is to expand on what we already have and to make it adaptable when we go back to that culturally relevant teaching piece.
Hi. I was wondering, when you were traveling around and listening to people, what people were saying were the main reasons that they weren't aware of or able to access existing resources? Because I think, GLSEN, for example, at least from DC, you're like, everyone knows GLSEN. And I don't know, whether it's like, if we move to open source, like how we can still bridge that barrier of like, people not being able to know where to look.
Yeah, I think I'm curious to know if either of you have heard this from teachers or not, but despite the fact that there are so few resources, teachers still say resource fatigue, right? Because there are not specifically inclusion resources, but there are so many resources for teachers, and everything else that they have to do, there are already so many resources out there, and they have to take the no time that they have to curate them and examine them and see what's useful and see where they can take things from and see where they're allowed to take things from and use things. And that just takes up so much time already that teachers aren't going to, again, spend 2.5 years looking for the organizations that are putting out these resources. If you Google LGBTQ education, I'm sure GLSEN would be one of the first things that comes up. But just the fact that it's not always a priority because there's so much else going on too, and that continues to be a big challenge of this work too. Even and especially when we're talking about queer students who are, facing much more severe and sort of immediately dangerous challenges in school than seeing themselves represented. And a lot of folks doing that work, aren't always ready to step back from like crisis intervention in school to rethink about what books we're including in the classroom, right? So all that sort of continues to be a challenge.
There's always intentions, like even in the club, we talked about doing a sort of, one of the kids said, let's do a timeline of LGBTQ history. I'm like, that's great. I'm like, oh my gosh, we have to start researching this. And I felt overwhelmed by that because they're in middle school, so they have the ideas, but not necessarily the drive to do it. So, and then I discovered the Queer America podcast, and I'm like, here we go. All right. So I listened to the first one. I printed out it wasn't even aimed at history teachers, but it was perfect for me. And I printed it out and I cut it up and we used it sort of as a go-around to do some self-teaching of history in the club. Just having that available accelerated that lesson, because otherwise it would have been like, well, on the back burner and I want to do it, but I wouldn't get to it. So it makes a huge difference just to have that ready to go. And of course I did modify it, but
GLSEN actually has an awesome timeline. I no longer work for GLSEN.
I did look.
Once a GLSENer, always a GLSENer.
So.
Yeah, they have a great timeline lesson. But I would also like to pivot back to what is the responsibility of district leaders in identifying these resources, where this conversation puts an awful amount of responsibility on the educator to go out and seek this knowledge, and teachers are already doing enough. They're doing a lot. And so what does it look like for districts to take the responsibility to literally spoon feed this stuff and offer it to educators so they don't have to look for 2.5 years, that they actually have it as a part of their offerings for curriculum, which look extremely different across all 24 districts of Maryland. But I think that we should be putting a little bit more responsibility on our school leadership to identify some of these resources.
And that's where we get in the student advocacy and the parent advocacy, and we get all this,
all together,
all this
right.
pressure.
I've pulled a lot of weird things from weird corners of the internet looking for resources for these things, and there's really no way for me even to tell if they're accurate. I don't know. I found one timeline one time when I was looking for that too, and I don't remember the name of the website, and it was just in like 10-point font. And it was just like 70,000 pages long, and right, and it was inaccessible. There wasn't really anything to do with it. There was obvious reasons why I had never found it before, but I started reading it, and it did have really accurate information in it that I had to cross-check. You know, it started with like history in the 1600s, I think, and I'm not so brushed up on my 1600s queer history that I was like, that's right. But all of this took so much work, right? And to your question, I think there's the reasons why teachers aren't aware of these things are pretty obvious, right? They don't have the time. They don't, like you just said, it's all up to them in order to find these things, and that's too much. Right?
Yeah, I'd also say like caution against sort of assuming that people do know of these things or about these organizations. Like even I think in a bubble like DC, and even as somebody who's like a whole gay, like I don't know if I would even be able to like point somebody to like every single LGBTQ organization or even the most prominent ones. So I think when you're sort of in certain spaces, it's easy to be like, why don't people go use Glisten's timeline? And some people might be like, who?
And it shouldn't be your job as the gay teacher in your high school to be the voice on all of this and to tell people what's right and what's not and walk them through. Sort of, again, spend the emotional labor to do all of that all the time.
Hi, I'm Ivy Love from New America. Higher education has come up a couple times in the conversation, but I wondered if you had any advice or specific asks for faculty, staff, institutions of higher education on how they can help move this work forward.
I'll say that, you know, when I was doing my teacher preparation in undergrad, you learn a lot of great stuff. I mean, educational psychology and intro to special ed. But I'd love to have a course on LGBT affirming classrooms. So I think that we've been seeing a lot of GLSEN chapters have been moving into this space where they're offering training to education departments for pre-service teachers to get some of that education. But what does it look like to have that to be either an elective or a requirement? And why stop at LGBT? I mean, just general diversity education. A lot of school districts are tripping over themselves tackling race equity. But how about not starting until they're a first-year 9th grade biology teacher and starting when they're a freshman education major? So I think that appending and augmenting the current teacher preparation curriculum to include some of this stuff would be a good place to start. And there's that.
I'm glad you mentioned the work on racial equity, because Montgomery County is one of those that's doing a lot of work on racial equity, and I'm hopeful that getting the LGBTQ equity it'll be a natural fit. Right? I mean, you're already getting people to examine their expectations, to examine their beliefs, and so you can do that around a lot of different perspectives.
I think a benefit of OER too is that it sort of allows for the opportunity to break out of talking about all of these sort of diversity, equity, inclusion groups of people as if they're mutually exclusive, right? Which is what has been my impression in higher ed so far, talking about these things, as maybe Ivy knows because we work together, but a group called Achieving the Dream is starting to sort of think about a lot of these things in the higher ed space for faculty and administrators and OER experts even, and have literally broken it down to race, socioeconomic, and gender and sexuality. And I do think in some situations it's really useful to do that, because if those three sort of areas have different challenges and different conversations, I think to some extent need to happen there, but they also don't exist in silos, right? Like we were just talking about, intersectionality must be the way forward for this, and that has been my impression so far of where higher ed folks are at as far as even beginning to have these conversations.
Cool. Any more questions? Yeah.
Sorry.
I didn't mention before, but I work at the Center for American Progress on our K-12 team, and something that we have been thinking about a lot as like a DC-based think tank is how we can do more community-informed conversations, more going out into states to learn more from people on the ground. And so I didn't know if you could speak to a little bit of your experience over the last 2.5 years, like building out networks and getting these, focus groups or conversations organized, and what your experience has been with that.
Sure. For me personally, one of the biggest frustrations in this work has been that despite the fact that I've been actively seeking out people doing this work and actively trying to create a network around it, I still feel like every time I do find folks doing it, it's because I've stumbled upon them, which is not bad to have stumbled upon them, right? At least we know each other now, but it just speaks to how siloed everyone is doing this work, and two, how not forefront in these conversations like queer and trans inclusion is, right? Again, for someone who's spent so much time actively seeking it out, to still be this hard to find folks has become really challenging, and some work that my colleague Christina and I have been thinking about moving forward is how do we identify this network in a way that's useful, not just for the sake of raising our hands and saying we're all doing this, and then kind of going back to our own schools and continuing to do it, but figuring out what's useful there, and especially, again, in a sort of think tank space, and our particular roles in this space as non-educators and non-qualitative researchers, thinking about what is useful, right? Do we need people always sort of end panels like this with, we need more conversations about this, which is fine, but we're not going to all come back here tomorrow and have the same conversation again. So what are we going to take with us, and what actual conversations are we going to have, and then what is going to come of those conversations? Think about those questions in terms of creating a network of people is a non-answer to your question, but is sort of what we're thinking about, and it's really broad and complicated to tackle, but certainly at least coordinating efforts in some way that is supportive and validating for the people doing that work is something that's sort of on the forefront.
Listen asks us to register our GSAs, but I don't know that, I've never seen that turn into a network, like a conversation space, which would be a natural way to kind of move into that. Because as educators, I could get a whole day with barely leaving my classroom, much less, going, we were saying I never even go down to the other floor. So it's not going to be a physical thing, but it could be virtual. I mean, if I could be connected with the other GSA leaders around the country, that would be a start, right?
Well, listen, Maryland does have a Maryland GSA Advisor Network. I'll be sure to add you to that Facebook group right after this panel, because we recognize the real power of that. There's so much co-teaching that happens with advisors and educators. And we have about, maybe 60 members on Facebook right now. So I'll add you to that. And when we're not doing teacher work, multi-agency coalition building has been really important. But something that I've done less of is the bringing people together, town hall style, and asking what their issues are. I know what the issues are. Baltimore is a heavily research surveyed town, and we can ask folks every year, and they're like, my teachers are still not using my pronouns. And I'll ask them again next year, and they're like, yep, still the problem. So I'm really focused on how do we build groups and coalitions to start working on some of the issues that we already know exists. I feel a little impatient with continuing to ask people what the problem is, and I'm more interested in asking people, is this the right solution?
Wrap up.
And I just want to say a huge thank you. So please, everyone join me in a big round of applause for this amazing panel. So yes, we will, we have a bar in the back for those of us who are here, and anyone online, thank you so much for joining us. And sorry we can't have a drink with you. But I'm just really thrilled to be able to host this today, and everyone have a great evening. Thank you.
I do